Over the last couple of decades, it seems like every country has grown obsessed with the idea of creating a smart city. An urban area where technology rules over us like a kind overlord, making our beds, taking out our trash, and recharging our cars. Many countries like Japan and Singapore have already begun the transition with promising results. But too many other ambitious billion-dollar projects are ending up as abandoned ghost towns with very little signs of life. Why are these projects failing? Today, I'm going to look for an answer by using the example of South Korea's $40 billion smart city, Songdo. This is a story of how a city, once pegged to be South Korea's new economic center, ended up, as one critic described it, like a modern-day Chernobyl. The story of Songdo begins like that of many other megaprojects, with an ambitious vision. In this case, during the early 2000s, two developers, Gale International and POSCO, took one look at Seoul and decided to create the exact opposite of that. So, on about 1,500 acres of land reclaimed from the Yellow Sea, they began constructing Songdo, a sustainable city that would be free of pollution, crowded spaces, and traffic. The city was modeled on Manhattan, but with a lot more green space. In fact, the original plans said 40% of the city would be reserved for trees, while massive cycling paths would take up dozens of kilometers of whatever little space was left for roads. The centerpiece of the city would be a garden literally called Central Park, and would be surrounded by several skyscrapers, much like its Manhattan namesake. The city was also going to be South Korea's most advanced yet. Computers would be placed along paths for pedestrians to use. Sensors on streets would allow authorities to control traffic, and all residents would be able to seamlessly communicate with one another on video calls. Parks would be fitted with automated irrigation systems, while trash tubes across the city would take garbage to a central plant, where it is automatically sorted. For 2003, this was pretty advanced stuff. Developers also plan to build 80,000 apartments, 50 million square feet of office space, and 10 million square feet of retail space. Surprisingly, the estimated cost of all these grand plans was only about $40 billion. For context, this is exactly 1/10 of the proposed cost of Telosa, a smart city that billionaire Mark Lohr is planning to build in the US desert. Fast forward to 2024 and Songdo is struggling. Not only are many South Koreans hesitant about moving to the city, but construction is still ongoing, with a revised completion date of 2025. Bear in mind that since the project began in 2002, the city was meant to be ready 3 times, in 2015, 2018, and 2022. All through the years, developers struggled to bring in investors and attract big companies to Songdo. By the mid-2010s, publications reported that massive office buildings and public transport networks were lying completely deserted. Many of the developers' promises weren't kept either. The technology turned out to be not as advanced as initially advertised, while the promise of large car-free zones was quickly forgotten in favor of drive-in Starbucks. Today, apartment complexes meant to house up to 9,000 residents are still waiting for families to move in. No bikes are parked in the various racks across the city, and there are no lines at banks, and barely anyone is using the computers that line the streets. It's a sad end to the story, but one we've heard far too often. So, what went wrong? Well, there are a few different factors to consider. For one, many locals felt like this project was never meant to cater to them at all, but only attract rich tourists to set up second homes in the region, and they weren't far off from the truth. The developers of Songdo are, at the end of the day, private companies that will always be profit-driven. This smart city, and the many others that are being built across the world, are always going to cater to high net worth individuals first. So it shouldn't come as a surprise that one of the biggest complaints across the board is that the cost of living in Songdo is way too high. And it's not just rent and tuition fees. Residents report that even the hospitals are out of reach on their modest incomes. In the long term, experts say this will create a massive gap between the rich and poor areas. But we don't even have to wait that long, because signs of this divide are already visible. Residents of the urban center have already more efficient waste management and recycling systems, while the families who live on the outskirts live on littered streets. Then there's another question worth asking. Are advanced waste systems, AI-powered sensors, and CCTV cameras enough to make a city thrive? Many would argue, in fact, that the opposite has been true. The world's most popular cities, like New York or Paris, are definitely known for their modern amenities, but they wouldn't be half as desirable if it weren't for their residents spending years building art movements, producing famous literature and films, and exporting music to the world. South Korea's planned city, by contrast, features no cinema halls, theaters, or concert venues. There's no place for art and culture to flourish, and there are very few spots to spend a weekend out with the family. Instead, the city has massive business districts, huge empty streets, and towering skyscrapers with tiny apartments. Far from a utopia, many argue that the developers essentially ended up creating a giant golden prison for wealthy people who want everything done for them. Now, don't get me wrong. Despite this strong criticism, Songdo has also done a lot right. Even though it failed to meet its initial population targets, the city is already home to over 200,000 people and counting. It also has successfully met many of its sustainability goals. For example, the city recycles up to 75% of all trash generated, a figure only matched by other environmentally conscious cities like LA and San Francisco. Unfortunately, the fact that it's unaffordable and frankly boring still continues to outweigh those pros. Recently, in an attempt to get the city back on its feet, developers are focusing on wooing foreigners once again. A newly built American town was launched to attract residents from the UK, US, Australia, Canada, and Germany. This massive apartment complex, developers say, has a more futuristic technology and also offers US and UK style education. Whether these tactics will help them succeed in building a culture or not, I'm not sure. But if there's one lesson I think future developers can learn from Songdo, it's that it takes more than a few tech buzzwords and grand ambition to make a city. Build strong communities first, and the rest will follow.